Imagine a single survivor, a lonely fugitive at large on the mainland Mauritius at the end of the 17th century. Imagine this fugitive as a female. She would have been bulky and flightless and befuddled, but resourceful enough to have escaped and endured when other birds didn't. Or else she was lucky. Maybe she had spent all of her years in the Bombas Mountains along the southeastern coast, where the various forms of human-brought menace were slow to penetrate. Or she might have lurked in a creek drainage at the Black River Gorges. Time and trouble had finally caught up with her. Imagine that her last hatchling had been snarked by an invasive feral pig, that her last fertile egg had been eaten by an invasive monkey, that her mate was dead, clubbed by a hungry Dutch sailor, and that she had no hope of finding another. During the past half-dozen years, longer than a bird could remember, she had not even set eyes on a member of her own species. Rhapis bucolitis had become rare unto death. But this one flesh-and-blood individual still lived. Imagine that she was 30 years old, or 35, an ancient age for most sorts of birds, but not impossible for a member of such a large-bodied species. She no longer ran, she waddled. Lately, she was going blind. Her digestive system was bulky. In the dark of an early morning in 1667, say during a rainstorm, she took cover beneath a cold stone ledge at the base of one of the Black River cliffs. She drew her head down against her body, fluffed her feathers for warmth, squinted in patient misery. She waited. She didn't know it, nor did anyone else, but she was the last and only dodo on Earth. When the storm passed, she never opened her eyes. This is Extinction, The Song of the Dodo, David Quammen, 1997.
The Mist is a 2007 horror film written for the screen and directed by Frank Darabont. The film follows a group of people who get trapped in a grocery store when a strange mist rolls into their small lake town in South Maine. Throughout the film, protagonist David Drayton, a commercial artist and devoted husband and father, comes into conflict with his difficult neighbor, played by Captain Ray Holt, as well as Mrs. Carmody, a deeply unstable religious zealot played by Marcia Gay Harden, who won a very deserved Saturn Award for her performance.
As Abraham prepared to sacrifice his only son to prove his love for God, so... Another down payment. A few more pennies in the jar.
As night falls and more Lovecraftian abominations make their main stage debut, taking lives and jeopardizing the store's infrastructure, the people within begin dividing themselves into factions, following either A, David, the concerned father and local, B, Captain Holt, whose attempts to facts and logic his way out of the mist ultimately ends up getting him killed, or C, Mrs. Carmody, who has convinced her followers that the mist and the monsters within are all a sign of God's wrath. During the climax, Mrs. Carmody demands a blood sacrifice from David's group to assuage the beasts of the mist, during which she is shot and killed by bag boy Ollie, love him, and David's group escapes into the mist, safe within the walls of his Toyota Land Cruiser. In a significant departure from the Stephen King novella on which the film is based, the group drives until they run out of gas. Still surrounded by the mist with no hope of rescue, David uses Ollie's 4 remaining bullets to kill his friends and only child, sparing them and leaving himself to die a horrible death at the hands of the beasts. Moments later, the mist clears, and David is rescued by a military vanguard. As he falls to the ground, wailing in agony over the wasted death of his son, the screen fades to black, and the credits roll. It is a stone-cold bummer from start to finish, features one of the bleakest endings I've ever seen on film, and it is one of my favorite movies. There have been many interpretations of The Mist. Writer-director Darabont is well known for his use of religious imagery and metaphor, particularly in his Stephen King adaptations, with The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile commonly interpreted as allegories for the crucifixion and resurrection of the big man himself. In The Mist, Mrs. Carmody refers to herself as God's vessel, and everything from the way she forms her congregation to the imagery used in her death works to depict her as a very Messiah-esque figure. Now, Does this mean that the film explicitly endorses her Old Testament worldview? That's a hard no. In contrast with his other adaptations of King's work, The Mist stands out as Darabont's first real crack at the horror genre. Many of the events that take place throughout both Shawshank and The Green Mile are horrifying, no doubt, but there's a stark contrast between this and this.
What the fuck? Get it off! Get it off! Get this freaking thing off me!
The seemingly supernatural elements at play in The Mist are much more in line with those of classic monster movies. Narrative metaphor in horror films tends to play by different rules than in period dramas such as Darabont's first two films, so while it's never interesting to boil something down to a one-to-one allegory, it is helpful to look at the cultural atmosphere of the time when trying to decipher what a filmmaker is trying to say with the themes present in their work. My read on The Mist is actually a lot simpler than the alleged biblical allegory for Noah's Ark, or Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, something going against God's will, punishment, for whatever. And my read begins with...
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning.
There's been a lot of scholarship done on the psychological effect that 9/11 had on Americans. A 2008 study found that in the days following the attacks, nearly 50% of Americans reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress, with reactions ranging from anger and political intolerance to newfound feelings of gratitude and spiritual awakenings. For many people, especially those in small towns, the anxiety associated with this new, larger-than-life threat beyond any one person's control was life-changing, and it shattered the illusion of safety that millions had, up until that point, taken for granted. In essence, The Mist tells a story about a group of people in a small town looking for answers to a larger-than-life threat with little information about where it came from or how to stop it. Is it a one-to-one allegory for America's collective emotional response to 9/11? No, but it does accurately capture that feeling of impending doom and search for meaning that most Americans were feeling at the time. In this way, it's a lot like Stephen King's 2005 adaptation of War of the Worlds. Again, a film ostensibly about how normal people respond to and deal with collective trauma brought on by some great and terrible catastrophe. And this is a unique strength of genre fiction such as horror. Movies like The Mist aren't something that you can really logic your way into because the movie isn't playing to your logic. Like sci-fi or fantasy or even musicals, horror asks you to accept a world where the rules of ours can be suspended or twisted in such a way that the film is able to access your emotions while bypassing all of that pesky logic armor. Through this, horror is able to access certain cultural or personal anxieties without directly depicting the objects of said anxieties. This is why films like The Mist, Man of Steel, and War of the Worlds, at least in its first half, have been able to resonate on such a mass scale, whereas more conventional dramas such as Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close and World Trade Center have not. It wasn't long after The Mist released to modest critical and commercial success, earning a 72% on Rotten Tomatoes and bringing in $57 million on an $18 million budget, that Frank Darabont was hired to develop and run a TV adaptation of Robert Kirkman's comic series The Walking Dead. For this video, I'd like to scale back the scope a bit and focus exclusively on the show's first two seasons and investigate what thematic questions Darabont was asking about humanity and the world at large during his time as showrunner. A time before The Governor, before Negan, and whatever the hell this is. Before we get into that, though, we should probably talk about the flesh eaters in the room. For the sake of the runtime, I'll keep this brief. If you're interested in more of an in-depth analysis of the zombies' origin and cultural history, I'll refer you to PBS Monstrum's 3-part video series on the topic, written and hosted by Dr. Emily Zarka, link in the description. To summarize, the zombie as we know it today has a very specific cultural origin, being an important part of Haitian Vodou, a religion born out of the West African diaspora, the members of which were displaced and forced into bondage during the transatlantic slave trade. The zombie, in its original form, is commonly interpreted as a manifestation of the fear of slavery extending into the afterlife. In Vodou, there are two spiritual elements that make up the soul, the Tibanange, which controls memory and consciousness, and the Gros Banange, which controls motor functions. Practitioners of voodoo can be turned into zombies when, during the process of death, a foreign party captures the Tibananj in a bottle, taking control of their personhood and dominion over their motor functions. It wasn't until actual cannibal William Seabrook, seriously, look it up, visited Haiti and chronicled his very white perception of voodoo in his novel The Magic Island that white America got their first taste of what we know today as the zombie. In his novel, Seabrook painted practitioners of Haitian voodoo as barbaric, wicked people who practiced black magic and raised the dead in satanic rituals. Ironically, a religion born from colonialism was itself introduced to contemporary audiences by this fucking colonizer ass. This depiction, which immediately caught the attention of the dominant white ruling class fighting to uphold Jim Crow, was, of course, incredibly wrong-headed and defamatory, and the art that this book inspired reflects this. White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi as the evil voodoo master, was Hollywood's first real stab at a zombie picture. Madge Bellamy has second billing as Lugosi's victim, turned into a zombie by black magic and forced into a life of servitude. This colonial interpretation of the zombie as an inherent threat to whiteness in art made by and for white audiences did not exist in a vacuum. Again, this was the time of Jim Crow, and it wasn't until the late 60s that the zombie was able to break this mold in popular media. Every horror filmmaker, particularly when working with zombies, owes something to George A. Romero. His 1968 opus, Night of the Living Dead, codified most of the tropes that are now part and parcel of the zombie subgenre. Massive hordes, killing via a blow to the head, and even the zombies as flesh eaters are all a part of the zombie movie starter pack because Romero was the originator. It would be accurate to say that the zombies in Romero's work don't actually fall in line with white America's early ideas of the zombie. The creatures in the film are referred to as ghouls, and Romero himself claimed to be inspired by Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, whose creatures more so resembled vampires than they did modern zombies. Daniel Kraus, one of the foremost scholars on Romero's work, and who posthumously co-authored Romero's novel, The Living Dead, said of the film,
because I think some of it happened kind of, especially with George Romero, happened sort of organically. And it's almost like after the fact, once they started being called zombies, which would have been sometime, I guess, early 70s or something.
It's easy to read a metaphor for the civil rights movement into Romero's work, and while he claimed to have written the character of Ben, the only black man and final girl of the film, aracially, Romero was a man of his time, and, knowing or unknowing, was influenced by the social climate of the era. The 70s and 80s saw an explosion of zombie films and related media, including Romero's 1978 follow-up, Dawn of the Dead. Unlike Night, Dawn is much more deliberate in its social commentary, with everything from its setting to the imagery used with the zombies to the way the main characters describe the film's faceless hordes. It's difficult to read Dawn as anything other than a scathing critique of American capitalism. Just listen to this clip.
What are they doing? Why did they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory of what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives.
There were a few other big names, such as Evil Dead's Deadites, which were more of an amalgam of zombies and demons, but it wasn't until the 90s that the zombie really broke into the mainstream. Not with film, nor even TV for that matter, but rather a newer art form that, in the decades following its inception, has taken pop culture by storm. Inspired by the rise of bioterrorism in Japan, Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's known overseas, was arguably the first anything to codify the plague zombie, an archetype that hits very different today than I'm sure it did back in '96. The game was a smash hit, ushering in an entire franchise of sequels and spin-offs, including a film series that, in the years following its final entry, has already been rebooted. Twice. In Resident Evil, we see humanity's fear of scientific progression in the T-virus, a mutated form of a fictional RNA virus manufactured by the Umbrella Corporation as a fundraising tool for their eugenics program. Said Romero of the zombie genre, "I do think the popularity of the creature has come from video games, not film." The ideas present in Resident Evil were built upon and arguably perfected by Alex Garland and Danny Boyle in the film that would revitalize the waning genre and usher in a new era of zombie media, 2002's 28 Days Later. Like Resident Evil, the zombie plague is manufactured and disseminated in a research facility, this time accidentally by a team of eco-terrorists looking to free a band of infected chimps from a lab. The virus quickly decimates Great Britain, leaving the rest of the world no choice but to quarantine the island while the survivors fight to to outlast the infected hordes. The film's biggest innovations, as far as we're concerned, are both related to speed. Both the epidemic curve of the rage virus and the infected themselves are incredibly fast, decimating Britain and leaving London abandoned and in ruins in less than a month. From here, we see a renewed interest in the zombie apocalypse as a whole, with Max Brooks' novels, fun fact, that's Mel Brooks' son, The Zombie Survival Guide, and World War Z tackling the issue of life in the end times in very different ways. World War Z, itself inspired by Studs Terkel's The Good War, an oral history of World War II, proved particularly poignant, what with its depiction of government ineptitude in handling a global pandemic. We can see this influence on display in the follow-up to 28 Days, 2007's 28 Weeks Later. 28 weeks after the initial outbreak, and only a few months after the virus was seemingly eradicated, the British government begins slowly returning civilians to the island, only for all hell to break loose when a carrier of the virus is found and studied by a team of American soldiers. All of these works, from Seabrooks to Romero to Max Brooks, played an important part in paving the way for the subject of this video. The biggest piece of the puzzle, however, the one responsible for contextualizing The Walking Dead's domination as, for a time, the highest viewed program on cable and broadcast TV in the 18 to 49 age demographic, is not the resurgence of zombie-related media in the early 2000s, and it's not post 9/11 American instability either. It's
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sing it, dude!
The late 90s and early 2000s saw a new wave of prestige serialized television programs that some scholars have dubbed the golden age of television. People like to point to The Sopranos as the original that, and while it was profoundly successful on HBO, it wasn't until rival Showtime debuted their flagship prestige drama, Russell T Davies' Queer as Folk, that the race to become the next big thing really took off. From HBO, we got 6 Feet Under and The Wire, NBC gave us The West Wing and Friday Night Lights, Showtime had the aforementioned Queer as Folk, as well as Dexter and Mad Men,
surprise, motherfucker!
And AMC found major success with arguably the greatest television series of all time and originator of countless Walter White memes, Breaking Bad. The show's first season garnered, well, not big ratings, but big for AMC, as well as a Primetime Emmy Award for Bryan Cranston, an award he would go on to win another 3 times in the following years. As the show went on, its success with both critics and audiences, as well as the Academy, continued to grow as well, ultimately earning the show 12 Emmys from 30 nominations. With the runaway success and acclaim of Breaking Bad, it was only a matter of time before Mr. AMC decided to diversify his portfolio and invest in bigger and more ambitious projects. Enter Frank Darabont, who, following an unsuccessful pitch to rival broadcast network NBC, brokered a deal with AMC to serve as showrunner on an adaptation of Robert Kirkman and Tony Moore's comic book, The Walking Dead. At the top of this section, I just want to say that this video is taking for granted the idea that you, the viewer, are already familiar with the first 2 seasons of The Walking Dead. As such, this section is not going to be super recappy like my last couple of videos have, so if, until now, you haven't caught up to this point in the series here, I'd recommend you go and do that before watching the rest of this video. In retrospect, The Walking Dead's first season feels less like, well, a first season, and more like a 6-episode pilot. It has a similar feel to the Disney Plus MCU shows, how The Falcon and the Winter Soldier feels kinda like a long movie divided into 6 chapters. Darabont himself insisted on the 6-episode format, given that the original comic was published in 6 issues per volume, and much of his tenure as showrunner was spent learning how to balance faithfulness to Kirkman's source material with creating an engaging and original television series. The show changes a lot in adaptation, and for the record, that's a good thing. You see, the original comic, while darker than most of its contemporaries published by major rivals Marvel and DC, has a very distinct tone from the show. Not better or worse, but definitely a bit less heavy. Artist Tony Moore actually drew the thing in black and white to emulate the feel of Romero's original Night of the Living Dead. However, many of the scenes featuring Rick and Glenn barreling through downtown Atlanta feel less like a desperate fight for survival and more like something you'd see in Capcom's Dead Rising. In the comics, Rick, Lori, Shane, and Morgan all hail from Kentucky, as opposed to the fictional King County, Georgia, as they do in the show. Laurie takes Shane and Carl to Atlanta to stay with her mother, only to find the city overrun by the time they get there. Other changes from the comics include the addition of new characters such as Jackie, Merle, and fan favorites Daryl and T-Dog, as well as the sidelining of Alan and Donna to make room for the Morales family. Much of the cast consists of familiar faces from Darabont's previous projects. Laurie Holden, Melissa McBride, and Juan Gabriel Perea all appeared in The Mist, and Jeffrey DeMunn has been a frequent collaborator of Darabont since the 1980s. The pilot plays out roughly as it does in the comics, albeit with a few changes that ultimately benefit the story in my opinion. Rick doesn't get a real close-up view of a walker until this moment, whereas in the comic he has to duck and dodge a whole horde of them before even leaving the hospital. The first big difference we see comes towards the end of the episode when Rick is approaching Atlanta in his cruiser.
Hello, can you hear my voice?
Hello, can anybody hear my voice?
Hey, hello?
Can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can hear you. You're coming through. Over.
For most of the early comics, our POV is strictly tied to Rick's, so this moment connecting us with Laurie and the rest of the camp is a good early indicator that it's not just going to be all Rick all the time. From here, the differences become more widespread as the show forms its own identity separate from the source material. The big character conflict in the first season, particularly after the Fish Fry Massacre, is between Rick and Shane, with Rick wanting to spend what resources they have left to go to the CDC, and Shane wanting to hit up Fort Benning some 100 miles in the opposite direction. This conflict between Rick and Shane is important because it highlights the differences in how both men navigate the apocalypse. This is also a departure from the comics. While there is a clear conflict between Rick and Shane, including the love triangle with Laurie, this more so stems from Rick's desire to lead the group away from Atlanta, whereas here Shane is the one that wants to stay close to the city. Shane's been holding out for a military rescue, and the guilt he feels over Amy and Jim's deaths is only compounded by the eventual realization that help is not coming. The comic's first volume actually ends with Carl shooting Shane in the neck during a confrontation with Rick. Just fucking drops him on the spot. If the first season is more of a 6-episode pilot, the second season really feels like the first season of what the show would go on to become. Darabont was still showrunner, at least before the mid-season break, and his influence is very much felt in the way the characters interact with each other, as well as the various ethical quandaries that arise over the course of the season's first half. Unlike season 1, which was so streamlined that it honestly felt at times like the show had to stop for a couple minutes while characters exposited to one another, season 2 reads more like a character study, which is actually very hard to do because it relies on the ability of the writers to explore interesting ideas with a lot of depth while still keeping the plot itself engaging enough to keep the viewer's attention. Did season 2 succeed in this regard? Well, it's complicated.
The barn's full of walkers.
There was a lot of behind-the-scenes bullshit between Darabont and AMC that has come out in the years following his departure. And while I don't want to get into all of it here, the long and short is that Darabont wanted to keep the high-budget 6-episode format of the show's first season, while Mr. AMC wanted season 2 to be drawn out to 16 episodes so they could sell more ad time. According to Mr. AMC, Darabont was also a bit out of his depth as showrunner, and while I can't speak to that, the profanity-laden emails sent by Darabont to producer Gail Ann Hurd during the second season's production do paint the image of a man at war for his creative vision. Either way, roughly halfway through production on the second season, Darabont was fired and replaced as showrunner by Glenn Mazzara, who himself would only last until the end of season 3. The show has actually gone through a surprising number of showrunners. Jeffrey DeMunn, who plays Dale, actually asked to be killed off once he found out about Darabont's firing. According to DeMunn, he only accepted the role as a favor to Darabont. Solidarity, love it. This is another departure from the comics, as there, Dale doesn't die until the group starts towards DC with Eugene and Abraham. Dale's death, however, actually serves to strengthen the story, in my opinion. More on that in a bit. As the show went on and the characters splintered off into their own factions, separated not only by ideology but by distance, the show got bigger, and many of the philosophical questions posed by Darabont in the first 2 seasons ended up getting lost. I feel this is a natural consequence of the continued renewal of a show like this. You can't have a clean resolution to ideas presented at the beginning because the foundation of narrative conflict is the denial of closure. And as the show has continued and become the thing Mr. AMC wanted it to be from the beginning, it's lost a lot of what I feel really made it special in its early days. The philosophy, the humanity, that je ne sais quoi that got people engaging with the story in the first place. For the rest of our time together, I'd like to examine what questions Darabont was asking about humanity, identity, gender, and all that wonderful stuff during his time as showrunner. What thematic questions are Darabont and his team asking with this show, and what lessons or morals can we take and apply to our own lives? This won't be a clean analysis. As previously stated, I'm going off the assumption that you, the viewer, are already familiar with this show's first 2 seasons, so you'll have to forgive me if I bounce around the timeline a little bit.
To hell with the guns. Shane is right. Merle Dixon? He's not worth one of your lives, even with guns thrown in.
There's a scene in the 4th episode of The Walking Dead's first season that I think about a lot. In the episode, we're introduced to a group of men the fandom has dubbed the Vatos Gang. The scene takes place in a warehouse where Rick, Daryl, and T-Dog are bargaining for the release of Glenn, who had been captured by the gang on a mission to retrieve a bag of guns. The Vatos Gang refuses to let Glenn go until Rick and co. hands the guns over. Daryl describes them as
guns worth more than gold. Gold don't protect your family, put food on the table.
And it looks like things are going to get violent until this happens.
Felipe! Felipe!
Abuela, go back with the others. Now!
Get that old lady out of the line of fire.
Abuela, listen to your mijo, okay? This is not the place for you right now.
Mr. Gilbert is having trouble breathing. He needs his asthma stuff. Carlito didn't find it.
It's here we learn the true nature of the Vatos Gang. This macho performance put on by Guillermo and his crew is a facade, a literal defense tactic put in place to protect the retirement home they take care of. Those nasty man-eating hounds Guillermo alluded to. See, Guillermo here was a custodian at this retirement home when all hell broke loose, and when most of the staff bolted, leaving the people living here to die, he and his right-hand man, a nurse named Felipe, stayed behind to take care of them and the families that had gotten trapped during the initial outbreak. The conflict ends when Rick, realizing the importance of Guillermo and Felipe's work, opts to share the guns, resolving a potentially violent conflict not through force or posturing, but through compassion and diplomacy. This is an important moment on Rick's journey. Not one day after this event and the subsequent fish fry massacre, he declares,
"We don't kill the living."
From his first appearance, Rick has always been one to approach difficult or frightening situations with an appeal to his subjects' humanity. This is often countered by a rude awakening of some sort, whether it be the zombie girl with the stuffed rabbit or Morgan's abrupt putting down of the walker outside Rick's house. Morgan here embodies the same narrative archetype as Toriel in Undertale, giving Rick a 101 on the strange new world he's woken up to, before proceeding to piece out of the show for the next 2 seasons. Rick is shown from the start to have strong leadership abilities, so by the time he whisks the group back to the safety of the camp, he is quickly established as the de facto leader of the group. And this position, one he states he wishes wasn't his, ultimately ends up working out for the group time and time again. It's not until season 2 where Rick's appeals to humanity start to be punished. In the season premiere, Rick makes a prayer to God for a sign, and the sign he gets?
No!
The message he takes from this is clear. His faith is to be placed in people, not idols. Contrast Rick with Herschel, who places his faith exclusively in idols and expects his people to do the same. He uses his faith to justify the way he extends his humanity to the walkers he keeps in the barn, sacrificing something in himself as he does. His care for the walkers can be seen as an overextension of his humanity, an extension that can never be reciprocated by its subjects. So when he finds Rick and his group on his front step, he has little left to give. Patricia is the same. She works in animal husbandry, and she has to shut off the part of her brain that empathizes with her animals in order to feed the barn walkers. Either way, the result is the same. The real and living suffer in service of the dead and decaying. Through this idea of shared humanity, we can come to understand the group as a single entity, a living, breathing organism comprised of smaller individual components. There's this recurring idea in most apocalyptic fiction of safety in numbers, what Freud referred to as herd instinct, a sociological phenomenon born out of a sense of group solidarity. For an analysis on how group solidarity stems from the sublimation of envy management, see ContraPoints' video on the subject, link in the description. The unity of the group is often threatened by the philosophical differences between Rick and Shane, with Rick believing that the health of the group is best maintained by caring for the health of its individual members. Maintain the cells, and the body will heal. Shane, meanwhile, takes a much more conservative, cut our losses and move on stance. He does not want to go back for Merle, nor did he support continued efforts to find Sophia. This is due in part to the fact that Shane himself has a complicated relationship with humanity. We'll get to that. Lori then acts as the voice of reason in the group, mediating the conflict between Rick and Shane while dealing with her own struggles herself. Dale, meanwhile, acts as the group's moral compass and the keeper of its philosophical sanctity.
I like what father said to son when he gave him a watch that had been handed down through generations. He said, I give you the mausoleum of all hope and desire, which will fit your individual needs no better than it did mine or my father's before me. I give it to you, not that you may remember time, but that you may forget it for a moment, now and then, and not spend all of your breath trying to conquer it.
It's through these appeals to shared humanity, both on the macro and micro level, that the group is repeatedly saved from what would otherwise be a bitter end. See Season 1's Fish Fry Massacre and Season 2's Attack on the Farm. Even Jenner, in his own twisted way, is taken by Rick's appeals, offering the group a new option altogether: a humane death, painless and dignified inside the walls of the CDC's Absolutely Safe capsule. Andrea is taken by this, as is Jackie, and with her so dies the dignity of choice. It's interesting, then, that it is Dale, the moral compass and endless source of wisdom, that forces Andrea's hand, committing what is, arguably, one of the most morally dubious acts in the show's first season.
Dale, get the hell out. I don't want you here.
Too bad. You don't get to do that. To come into somebody's life, make them care, and then just check out.
There's a big shift right at the end of Season 2's mid-season finale. I'll be honest, when I first watched this scene with my mom when I was, 12 years old, I remember turning to her and just breaking down crying. This moment right here was something I'd been dreading since she was first chased into the woods by the herd. I remember being so invested in the search for Sophia, in part because she was around my age, and therefore easier to identify with, but also because I could tell just how much finding her meant to everybody. Rick insisted on keeping the search going well after logic dictated it should, because if they found her and she'd been hurt in some way, that would be on him. That moment when she steps out of the barn and confirms everyone's worst fears is Rick's first real taste of what catastrophic failure feels like. And just like how we didn't get from
He's my best friend. How you think that I'm not happy about that?
To
I'm a better father than you, Rick. I'm better for Lori than you, man.
overnight, this moment is what allows Rick to go from this
We don't kill the living.
to this. Rick's not the only one who loses something here, though. Obviously, the biggest loss is felt by Carol, who loses not only her daughter, but the last thing anchoring her to her life before the apocalypse. Daryl, meanwhile, loses the sense of purpose that had been driving him for the better part of 7 episodes now, resulting in him shutting himself off to everyone around him, including Carol.
You cared about what happened to Sophia. Cared what it meant to the group.
Carl also loses something. Finding Sophia is important to him because she's the only one left for him to relate to. Without her, Carl finds himself adrift. This frustrates him, and he takes out his frustration in a way that is honestly a little reflective of those 12-year-old boys who would troll r/atheism all day with their Shadow the Hedgehog avatars.
You know, we'll see Sophia again in heaven someday. She's in a better place.
No, she's not. Heaven is just another lie. And if you believe it, you're an idiot.
Frank Darabont is actually very careful when dealing with children. All of the violence done to them in his work is either implied or done off-screen, which stands in stark contrast to the show's later seasons. It's refreshing how tastefully the show handles the reveal of Sophia's death. It's tragic, but it's not overly indulgent or exploitative, so we're able to feel the full weight of the scene in the same way the characters do. One could argue that, with Sophia, Carl lost what remained of his childhood, and his Shadow the Hedgehog arc ends with Rick christening him a man long before he's ready. This isn't a War of the Worlds situation, however, how the son is christened a man through no displayed virtue of his own, and it ultimately ends up ruining the movie. Rick christens Carl a man out of necessity once he realizes that he can't allow Carl to continue wandering through this liminal space between boyhood and manhood, as the frustration that builds from that is, in itself, dangerous. Carl can't be out here skipping stones with his My Little Walker when he's also inadvertently causing the deaths of the group's keepers.
What's the difference between men and women? That's a joke. No, serious.
There's been a lot of scholarship done by feminist news and media outlets on the portrayals of women and gender as a whole in The Walking Dead. One episode in particular comes to mind, being the one where Lori decides not to abort her pregnancy. Many have read this scene as the show aligning itself with the pro-life movement, or at the very least some version of anti-abortion ideology. When analyzing this scene,
I found these. So Glenn knows, right? Instead of coming to me, you send him to get pills?
it's important to look at it in the context of this scene.
You should have seen it. What? Dear. It was so pretty, Mom. It was so close.
Throughout Season 2's first few episodes, Lori had been wondering whether it would be more humane to allow Carl to die rather than live and potentially die an even worse death later down the road. Rick is torn on this, caught between his belief in humanity and the trauma that came with seeing his son shot and operated on without anesthesia. So this moment here is an affirmation of hope for the future.
That's what he was talking about when he woke up. Not about getting shot. What happened to the church? He talked about something beautiful, something living. There's still a life for us, a place, maybe like this. It isn't all death out there, it can't be. We just have to be strong enough after everything we've seen to still believe that. Why is it better for Carl to live, even in this world? He talked about the deer. Lori, he talked about the deer.
The scene where Carl gets shot actually mirrors a scene in another of Stephen King's adaptations, Stand By Me. In both scenes, the deer represents innocence, as well as a sense of hope for the future. So, given that the deer scene in Stand By Me ends like this, and the deer scene in The Walking Dead ends like this, Lori's quandary here is certainly not without merit. That question of how could I morally justify bringing a child into such a world of pain and uncertainty is one that many prospective parents have been asking themselves for years. Once again, this ties into that theme of shared humanity, the childhood innocence that Rick is so passionate about preserving that is ultimately stripped from Carl by the death of Sophia, forcing Rick's hand and declaring him a man long before he's ready. It's worth noting that the scene in which Lori makes her decision occurs before the discovery of Sophia and long before the deaths of Dale and Shane and the destruction of the farm. Obviously, the security blanket of the farm is part of what drives Lori and Rick to keep the baby. Lori throwing up the pills here is less the writer's assertion that abortion is wrong or immoral, and more so an affirmation that life, even in times of great fear and uncertainty, is still worth living. Your mileage may vary with how much that message resonates with you, and it's one that comes into conflict with the ultimate conclusion of this season, but I certainly don't see it as the right-wing roadmap that some have chosen to read it as. It's worth noting here that Robert Kirkman, the comic series creator, has a somewhat interesting relationship with gender and the sexes. In a 2009 interview with The Village Voice's Simon Abrams on the subject of the representation of women in The Walking Dead, Kirkman had this to say.
I don't mean to sound sexist, but as far as women have come over the last 40 years, you don't really see a lot of women hunters. They're still in the minority in the military, and there's not a lot of female construction workers. I hope that's not taken the wrong way. I think women are smart, resourceful, and capable in most things as any man could be. But they are generally physically weaker. That's science.
So, ignoring the blatant disregard for employment discrimination in male-dominated fields, as well as the very existence of trans people who generally fall outside of Kirkman's definition of men and women, which is a little hard, Bobby Boy is presenting here an ideology of gender essentialism, masquerading as a recitation of generalized sexual dimorphism in humans. This argument that men and women have differences in muscle growth as a result of their natural physiological development is the reason for why little boys grow up to be soldiers and little girls grow up to be homemakers is a favorite among conservatives in male-dominated spaces, which is all of them. You hear that, Atlanta? Robert Kirkman says girl can't be CEO. As our understanding of gender evolves, so too does the way in which gender interacts with the workforce. Second-wave feminists coined the idea that gender is a social construct, and the foundational text for the theory of gender performativism is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. In the text, Butler argues, among other things, that both gender and sex are constructs that limit social mobility, and that acts traditionally used to express gender themselves are gender, and to abstain from these acts is to puncture the house of cards that is social gender constructs. For more on this, I've linked an old PhilosophyTube video in the description. Now, am I vastly oversimplifying an incredibly complex and nuanced piece of gender theory? Yes. The Walking Dead actually features a very rigid division of labor between hunters/camp defenders and manual laborers. Lori, Carol, and in the first season, Amy and Jackie all take care of the cooking, laundry, and childcare, while the men of the group spend their days making runs into town and combing the woods for Sophia. There's even a really lame scene in the second half of season 2 where Lori confronts Andrea about crossing this proverbial gender line. One could certainly argue that Lori and Carol are performing a certain type of womanhood by volunteering for the positions as a way of hanging on to their past identities as mothers and housewives, and Lori chastising Andrea, a formal civil rights attorney, for not pulling her weight with the dishes and laundry could tie into this theme. However, that's about as much leeway as I'm willing to give the team on this one, and for the record, the comics are even worse about this. Just take a look at this panel that already had people rolling their eyes back in 2003. And I'm not saying I hate Lori as a character, because I don't. I'm actually a very passionate member of the Lori Grimes Defense Committee. I'm just saying that Kirkman is a straight white man from Kentucky who was born in 1978 and works in comic books. Not exactly expecting Judith Butler here, but even I have to admit that, even with all the leeway I'm willing to extend to these writers, this gender essentialist bullshit does start to bug. The second scene in the pilot, the first one after the cold open, starts with Rick asking Shane,
"What's the difference between men and women?"
And then the two pal around about Shane's casual sexism before veering into love triangle territory. That question, what's the difference between men and women, is Rick's attempt to rationalize his and Lori's failing marriage. And we even see a similar scene in a flashback with Lori and one of her girlfriends later on in season 2. Perhaps what we see here is an anxiety on display, the fear of loss of manhood, womanhood, and with it, the loss of the traditional family unit that Rick and Lori have fought so hard to maintain. We see the dark side of this dynamic with Carol, the battered wife who has to go through a gauntlet of grief and trauma in order to heal and move on with her life. And it's scenes like these.
My Sophia was alone in the woods. All this time, I thought, she didn't cry herself to sleep. She didn't go hungry. She didn't try to find her way back. Sophia died a long time ago.
And these.
I wanted to die my way. Not torn apart by drooling freaks. That was my choice. You took that away from me, Dale.
And yes, even these.
You tear into me for keeping secrets when you're holding on to this.
You want me to bring a baby into this? To live a short, cruel life?
That are the reason why I just can't get on board with the idea that the women in the show aren't as developed or fully realized as the men. I'm sorry I can't make you empathize with complex women. I'll just get back in my corner here at the liking female characters everyone hates store. there's this common-ish criticism of the show, or at the very least its female characters, that they aren't written particularly well. Critics typically point to the scene where Andrea shoots Daryl,
I shot Daryl.
as well as the scene where Lori flips her car on an empty road as a sign of the general ineptitude of the women on the show. And yeah, I guess if you like the show because you love it when the zombies go ooh, and you want every character to be a carbon copy of Daryl Dixon, then I could understand being annoyed by Andrea's unrelenting need to self-actualize.
I shot Daryl.
Don't be too hard on yourself. We've all wanted to shoot Daryl.
And yeah, Lori flipping her car was dumb, but I chalk that up more so to the execution of the scene rather than as some indictment of Lori as a character. Sure, the scene could have worked, but the execution was so sloppy that it might as well have had cartoon slapstick noises attached to it. Either way, while the writers may occasionally pop a squat over their women in order to drum up some character action, those scenes tend to be outliers in an otherwise solid show. Remember, first two seasons. And one final note to the crowd complaining about the show's supposed agenda, because it does bear repeating. I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of months pondering this scene and the implications it has for the show's themes. And if you're sitting there watching this scene, and your main takeaway is that he's mad at her for taking Plan B because he thinks abortion is wrong, it's just like, alright.
He talked about the deer.
Wait a minute, the point, dude.
But what the world is out there isn't what you saw on TV. It is much, much worse, and it changes you. Either into one of them or something a lot less than the person you were. Please do not send us out there again.
In his study, Terror Management Theory and Identity, The Effect of the 9/11 Terrorist Attacks on Anxiety and Identity Change, Professor of Psychology Curtis Dunkel defines identity formation as a three-step process that revolves around finding one's place within a chosen worldview. Dunkel argues that the political salience of terrorism in the aftermath of 9/11 produced greater anxiety about the loss of one's identity and personal safety. In his study, he found that those that were in the midst of exploring their identity when the 9/11 terror attacks occurred felt more anxiety about their lack of identity, which then motivated greater exploration as well as greater commitment to one's chosen worldview. Dunkel's study is an investigation into what's known as the cultural worldview defense, a psychological system that sublimates fear of death into a zealous attachment to a cultural worldview, which researchers have proposed offers the subject a kind of symbolic immortality. The Twin Towers, for example, were a symbol not only of economic power, but of national security and prosperity, and with them fell the security blanket that millions of Americans had taken for granted. This system of sublimation is known as terror management theory, and it is often intensified by traumatic events. Death anxiety is present in some form in every world culture, and most religions offer some form of immortality, whether it be through the afterlife or an endless cycle of reincarnation. This often forms the foundation of what we refer to as self-esteem, or as Dunkel describes, the belief that one is achieving the prescribed standards of one's cultural worldview. As Dunkel argues in his study,
subtle reminders of death, a period of distraction following mortality salience, and an environment that facilitates gut reactions to questions all have been found to produce greater cultural worldview defense after mortality salience, in comparison to strong and overt reminders, immediate cultural worldview defense after mortality salience, and an atmosphere that produces rational thought. The events of 9/11 had a profound impact on the entire American population. Those who were exploring showed more anxiety under terrorism salience, and those who were not showed diminished anxiety. The results also show that terrorism salience had an impact on the identity processes. Terrorism salience caused greater commitment in the high exploration group.
he concludes,
"It has been proposed that global conflicts in the 21st century will not center around monetary, territorial, or ideological issues, Huntington 1996, but that issues of identity will be at the root of frictions."
And in The Walking Dead, the fear of death, which Dunkel describes as
the ultimate identity loss,
is best embodied by none other than the walkers themselves. Early on in the show's run, before Mr. AMC committed to this idea of the walkers as mindless beasts wholly removed from their past lives, there was evidence of memory in the walkers. Perhaps acting on instinct or muscle memory, two of the most prominent walkers featured in the pilot, those being the little girl at the campsite and Morgan's wife Jenny, display some level of cognition. See the moment where the little girl walker bends over to pick up her stuffed bunny, or when Jenny returns to the house where she, Morgan, and Dwayne had been hiding out and attempts to enter through the front door. Early on, the show insists on its walkers' past personhood. The other walker prominently featured in the pilot, the bicycle zombie, seemingly torn apart by an entire horde, was actually given a name and a backstory in a web series titled Torn Apart. Her name is Hannah, and Rick's act of humanity to her here.
I'm sorry this happened to you.
Sets the tone for the rest of Darabont's time as showrunner. He builds on this moment in episode 2, where Rick eulogizes the walker whose guts he and Glenn used to blend into the horde.
Wayne Dunlap, Georgia license, born 1979. He had $28 in his pocket when he died. And a picture of a pretty girl.
This ability of Rick and Glenn's to successfully pass as a walker is also present in the comics, as is the event that ends up foiling their efforts. When analyzing this portion of the show, it's important to contextualize it as an adaptation. The comic's first edition was published in late 2003, and you'll never guess what was going on in America in 2003.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Just so you know, we're on the good side. If y'all do not want war.
The radio station set up these garbage cans for people to throw out their CDs.
We've already discussed the gender issues the show dips its toes into, but what's more pertinent here is the ways in which characters' skill sets and roles in the group are tied into their past lives. Glenn was a pizza delivery man, a job that gave him a great deal of knowledge about the ins and outs of Atlanta's downtown quarters. Likewise, Jackie previously worked in the city zoning office, and her knowledge of infrastructure comes in handy multiple times during her brief stint on the show. However, the apocalypse also opens up the opportunity to redefine oneself, free from the shackles of one's old life. Through the deaths of Ed, Sophia, and Amy, Carol and Andrea lose the forces anchoring them to their pasts, allowing them to explore themselves more freely and emerge as new and changed people. Now, with regards to Sophia and Amy in particular, one could certainly argue that the price one has to pay for this personal reinvention simply isn't worth it. And I do agree with that. The situations Andrea and Carol find themselves in are horrific, and their character development is necessary in adapting to the ever-evolving environment around them. They could stay stagnant in protest of the world around them, but as we've seen on the show, refusal to change in tandem with one's environment often leads one to do horrific things. However, there's such a thing as going too far in the other direction, as seen in Season 2's Randall arc. Here, we see the group wrestle with the idea of executing a young man and hostage from another group in order to ensure the safety of the farm. As Dale puts it,
so the answer is to kill him to prevent a crime that he may never even attempt?
This arc is the true nadir of the group's time on the farm, and it's not until Dale's death that Rick is recalibrated towards shared humanity and mercy, albeit for a limited time only.
From now on, we're gonna do it his way. That is how we honor Dale. This isn't a democracy anymore.
Back at the CDC, incompetent Dr. Jenner walks the group through the infection process. And pay attention to the way he talks about the brain here.
What are those lights?
It's a person's life, experiences, memories. It's everything. Somewhere in all that organic wiring, all those ripples of light, is you. The thing that makes you unique and human.
Jenner creates a clean boundary between body and personhood. The brain is us, the body is an extension of us. Our identity, our personhood, the things that make us who we are, is in our head, not our body. Through this distinction, it's implied that the value of the mind, and therefore the person, far outweighs the value of the body. We see this in action with Merle, who is willing to shed part of his body in order to protect his personhood. And what are walkers?
It restarts the brain?
No, just the brain stem. Basically, it gets them up and moving.
But they're not alive.
You tell me.
It's nothing like before. Most of that brain is dark.
Dark, lifeless, dead. The frontal lobes, the neocortex, the human part, that doesn't come back. The you part. Just a shell driven by mindless instinct.
People who have lost their identity, their personhood. People whose bodies outlive them. This dichotomy between body and self actually has a bit in common with the zombies of Haitian Vodou. Again, the person is gone, stolen, and the body is left without an identity of its own. So we return to that question of what do the walkers in The Walking Dead represent? Well, like I said, it's never interesting to boil something down to a one-to-one allegory, but for my money, I'd argue that the walkers represent the fear of loss of identity, particularly in a post-9/11 world of political turbulence and uncertainty. Listen to the way Jenner describes the infection.
It invades the brain like meningitis. The adrenal glands hemorrhage, the brain goes into shutdown, then the major organs.
It attacks the adrenal glands, the part of the body that regulates the immune system and, more importantly, the way the body responds to stress. Like how anxiety is sublimated in terror management theory, the fear of loss of identity infects the adrenal glands and takes command of the body. It doesn't matter where the infection came from, because what's important now is that it exists, and it's here, and it's not going away anytime soon. There are moments in Season 2 where certain characters, in times of great stress, mimic the aesthetic of the walkers, occasionally foreshadowing the end of their arcs. The difference between these moments and Rick and Glenn's attempt to blend in with the herd is that these moments with characters such as Shane and Daryl are an indirect consequence of times where they are forced to compartmentalize their humanity, rather than the direct aim of their actions. Rick and Glenn are punished in the narrative for attempting to pass as walkers, while Shane and Daryl are punished in the narrative by passing as walkers.
I shot Daryl.
I said before that the zombie has always been a tool to discuss some anxiety of the day. From slavery to Jim Crow to Japanese eco-terrorism, the zombie is an important staple of any given era's cultural psychology. There is no more defining an event of early 21st century America than the fall of the Twin Towers, and it would be willfully dense to pretend like this show or the comic it's based on were not in any way a reflection of the times. Obviously, my reading of The Walkers is not the reading of The Walkers, and one could make arguments any number of ways for what it is they symbolize, if they symbolize anything at all. My conclusion is informed by the text of the show, the cultural atmosphere at the time of its source material's creation, and the history of the zombie as a reflection of cultural anxieties. The Walking Dead is a case study in narrative metaphor, and it's a shame that its legacy has been tarnished by the likes of Scott Gimple and the higher-ups at AMC, because when you peel back the layers of these first 2 seasons, what you're left with is a wealth of social commentary and character development. Characters such as Rick, Lori, Andrea, and Shane are all ripe for analysis because their writing is just that good. Shane's arc in particular is thrilling to watch as he descends from good guy with a gun to genuine safety hazard and eventual maker of his own demise.
Raise your gun. You're gonna have to kill an unarmed man.
It's the time of the video, huh? Shane is fundamentally a figure of envy. Like Salieri in Amadeus and Scar in The Lion King, Shane's envy informs his actions on his path to self-destruction.
Grazie, signore.
Unlike someone like Scar, however, what's interesting with Shane is that his envy began as romantic jealousy, defensive over the obstacle in his relationship with Lori posed by Rick's return. It would be fair to say that Shane and Lori's affair wasn't an affair in the traditional sense, as both parties truly believed Rick to be dead. While Shane had been envious of their relationship for some time before the apocalypse, it's clear that Lori was more so using the tryst as a way of coping with the state of the world. Shane's arc in the first 2 seasons plays out like a set of falling dominoes. It's Rick's return and his reunion with Laurie that sets Shane's dominoes in motion, and this scene in Tell It to the Frogs is evidence of this.
My husband is back. He is alive.
He's my best friend. Look how you think that I'm not happy about that.
How dare you? Why would you be? You are the one that told me that he died.
The dominoes are falling now, and with each passing day, Shane's jealousy, defensive of his relationship with his romantic subject, turns offensive, envious, as his romantic subject abandons him for his rival. The scene at the CDC, in which a drunken Shane attempts to rape Laurie, is where the first major threshold in his descent is crossed. The dominoes are really falling now, and Shane's Season 2 sacrifice of Otis in service of Carl symbolizes the kind of villain he is. His actions are motivated. With Otis's murder, I can at least place myself in his shoes enough to understand his decision from a psychological perspective. It's Shane's sacrifice of Otis that truly thrusts him into villainy, as illustrated by his post-sacrifice buzz cut, shedding part of his body out of necessity and hiding the only evidence of his descent in plain sight. Check out his off-center Kubrick stare. The guilt he feels lying at Otis's funeral, fabricating the story of Otis's heroism in front of Laurie, Patricia, and God himself, only furthers him down this path. It's fitting that Dale, the keeper of the group's humanity, would be the first one to recognize this descent, to suspect Shane's sacrifice of not only Otis, but his own humanity as well.
He's dangerous.
Yeah, he's a hothead.
No, Laurie, he's dangerous. I think he killed Otis.
Otis was killed by walkers.
He knew how to handle walkers. Otis was the one who was putting him in the barn.
You need to be really clear with me right now. What are you saying?
I believe that Shane sacrificed Otis. I can't prove it, but I think that he shot him and left him for bait so that he could get away.
It would have been interesting if after Dale told Laurie confronted Shane and he put 2 and 2 together and took Dale out like poor Ned Stark.
I'm telling you, I knew guys like him. And sooner or later, he's gonna kill somebody else.
This is the difference between Rick and Shane. Rick recognizes and appreciates the value of all human life, whereas Shane refuses to extend his empathy past those in his immediate vicinity. He didn't want to go back for Merle, he didn't want to risk the trip to the CDC, and he was willing to sacrifice his own humanity in order to save Carl's life. This last scene between Rick and Shane is fascinating, and it so clearly illustrates the depths Shane has fallen to as a man, ending in the total loss of his identity. This isn't where he crossed the point of no return, however. One could argue that, even with the sacrifice of Otis, there was still room for a redemption arc. It's not until the murder of Randall that Shane crosses that last threshold, and this moment here is the final nail in the coffin of Shane Walsh. Face bashed in, mouth full of blood, skin pale in the light of the moon, Shane's transformation into a walker is his own doing. And it's not Rick, but Carl, the boy he sacrificed his own humanity to save, who ultimately ends up putting him down. Rick leaves this face-off a changed man, a lesser man even, as he has to bring himself to Shane's level in order to protect the people he cares about. Rick actually accomplishes this with an appeal to Shane's humanity.
Now listen to me, Shane. There is still a way back from this. Nothing has happened here. We're gonna lay down our guns. We're gonna walk back to the farm. Together. Back to Laurie. Back to Carl. Put this all behind us.
One that he gives into, and one could argue that the threshold Rick crosses here at the very least mirrors the one Shane crossed with Otis. Season 2's ending is, in a word, bleak, because the one person in this entire group who has been unflinching in his belief that there is room for life and hope and civilization in this world has to stoop to the level of his own personal antagonist in order to keep his loved ones safe. And as this moment communicates,
this isn't a democracy anymore.
Once you cross that threshold, there's no going back. Let's go back to that question I asked at the top of this video. What thematic questions are Darabont and his team asking with this show, and what lessons or morals can we take and apply to our own lives? It's important here to state plainly that Season 2 is far from the end of the show, and as The Walking Dead has continued to expand and grow past Darabont's original vision, some of these questions have remained. And I want to say that plainly because Season 2's ending is not prepared to wrap up any of these ideas on its own. It was, after all, explicitly designed not to, leaving the door open for an entire franchise of spin-offs and video games. And here's the thing about these big thematic questions. They're only relevant insofar as the audience is able to engage with them in a way that holds space for individual interpretation. Art, great art, is a conversation between the artist and the audience, and one really cannot exist without the other. You know, there's something really special about a show like this taking the time to explore the idea of elder care in the apocalypse. Early Walking Dead is far from perfect. T-Dog is introduced to be the victim of racist violence at the hands of Merle, only for Rick, the good white cop, to step in and save the day. And he spends most of the rest of the show as kinda just the black guy, never really given any storylines or scenes of his own to help us get to know and care about him before he dies in Season 3. Spoilers. And T-Dog is far from the only great character introduced in these seasons who gets unceremoniously axed in later seasons for a cheap ratings boost. Herschel, Glenn, and especially Beth all get shafted in pretty much the same way. I do wonder what could have been had Mr. AMC found a way to compromise with Darabont. Given the quality of the show's later seasons, or lack thereof, I do think tighter 8 to 10 episode seasons would have been a good middle ground. For God's sake, I'm like Season 2's biggest defender, and even I think it drags in places. In addition to my undying reverence for Frank Darabont's work, I also have personal reasons for zeroing in on this era of the show. Seasons 1 and 2 were the ones my mom and I watched together when I was a kid. Watching TV together was always kind of our thing, and a lot of my taste over the years has been either directly or indirectly shaped by our time together. In these times of uncertainty, I've found myself falling back on these old nostalgic things, not only for comfort, but also as a sort of guiding force. There's value in these smaller, self-contained seasons. I live in the city, and there's only so much room to breathe here, so if I can take the time to step back and immerse myself in this world for 19 episodes, perhaps it can help me reach some new conclusions about our own. I believe in shared humanity, and I believe that even in a world where it feels like all of its elements are working against you, there is solidarity and strength to be found in your fellow humans. And in a country where queer people's identities are being used against us and transphobic violence is reaching an all-time high, it's now more important than ever to engage with your comrades and take care of your community. Remember that line from the best Star Wars movie.
That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate. Saving what we love.
But hey, humans are the real virus.
We are the Walking Dead.
Zombie go, ooh.
By the way, you're talking about not just Prison Break, but The Walking Dead as well.
Walking Dead, Colony, like all very, very violent shows. Also very focused on family in their own way. And shows I'm really proud of. But I wanted to tell a story that didn't come down to who's the strongest person in this fight. And I personally, I was like, I need content that's gonna make me feel like we can do this. Like we can be good to each other, like we can face down the bad parts of ourselves in order to be better to children. I need to feel like we can make it. And so I want to tell that story. And I just lost Scott Wilson to leukemia. And my father-in-law was dying of brain cancer. He passed away in between the pilot and the series. Actually, the last thing I did with him is I crawled up in bed with him in his hospice room, and I showed him the pilot. And so it hit a lot of personal notes that I really was looking for.